All right, so we made it past the opening. You've only made a few moves. They've been calculated. You've been well defended, but you've staked your claim on the board. Now we're going to look at the middle game, and the middle game has infinitely more to it than the opening does. It can easily overwhelm players and seem very complicated. But it's also really where the artistry in chess comes in. Because there are so many options, it lets you really show off what kind of a chess player you are. And when you're able to find complex tactics and combinations is extremely satisfying. So we're going to look at some extreme basics on setting up first our tactics and then our positional play and then putting it together and making sure that we're not blundering. So first off, we need to talk about the respective value of each piece. Now, in the beginning, we discussed that the king is the most valuable piece because if you lose it, you lose the game. So you cannot trade your king for any other piece. It's impossible. It won't even let you do it. It's not a legal move. So for now, we're just going to take the kings off the board. Now, the most valuable piece, point-wise, besides the king, would be the queens. People who analyze the game and have given us a way to keep score, even though chess you really only win or lose or draw, there's a score during the game to show who's doing better and who's doing worse, who has more on the board and who has less. The queens count as 9 points each. The pawns count as 1. The knights and the bishops each count as 5. As 3. And the rooks count as 5. So 1. Let me bring that knight back. 1 for the pawn. 3 for the knight. 3 for the bishop. 5 for the rook. 9 for the queen. Now these are not hard and fast because, for instance, not that this could ever happen in a game, but look at this queen. This queen here in the corner on A8, black's queen, is so much worse than white's queen. Let's say white's queen's here. And there's not a rook attacking it. Why is this queen so bad? Well, look how many moves it would take for it to ever get to even play. You would have to move this pawn, and that lets it out, but now it has to move over here. Even here it's being attacked. It is so stuck in the corner that it's not considered a good piece. So while queens are worth 9 points, black would love to get rid of both queens because the white queen is infinitely stronger than the black queen stuck over here in the corner. This is never going to happen. It's just to illustrate that there are different times when pieces' value can change. In the same way, knights tend to be worth more in the beginning when the position is more closed or when everything is locked up, jammed together, when all the pawns are still on the board and they're all running into each other. That's a closed position. If you remove most of the pawns or even a few pawns, now your bishops can be a lot stronger because there aren't things in their way. So at the beginning, knights are typically a little better, and towards the end, when things are off the board and it's a lot more open, the bishops tend to be a little bit better. Then you have the rooks. The rooks are considered to be worth 5 points. And then the queens, of course, the queens having the most movement options of all. So that's how you're going to evaluate if you want to make a trade or not. If I could figure out how this works, if I am defending my queen with this pawn, yes, it's defended. That means whatever, if anything takes it, I will take it back. But white is more than thrilled to trade this pawn for this queen. Sure, they lost their pawn, but their pawn is only worth 1 point, and the queen was worth 9, so they just got 8 points. That's a fantastic trade for white. Likewise, I would love to trade my bishop for white's rook. Even if white had it defended and was able to capture back. because the rook is worth more than the bishop. So you're just gaining points by trading your weaker pieces for the other person's stronger pieces. You'll get to some trades where you have to figure out, is it worth it to take this knight with my bishop? They're both about the same. We'll talk about that later. But for now, we're only looking at the hard and fast math of the tactics behind some of these different moves. So now that you know how the points work, we can look at some different tactics. And we're only going to cover the very basics here because it would just take too much time otherwise. But as I said before, there are many wonderful other YouTube videos. I'll probably do more on them. This is just to get us all started. There are a few different kinds of tactics. One is called a pin. And a pin is when a piece is stuck to the king. This queen cannot move. It is pinned to the king, because if it were to move, the king would be in check and would be taken, which is not legal. So this queen is not allowed to move. That means the white player is free to take it. As long as you are pinning a stronger piece with a weaker piece, it's almost always going to be good for you. Now, the other person might have counterplay, which we'll talk about later, but this is a pin. Now, a little different version of this. This is called a skewer. Now, it's the same concept, but here the piece behind is weaker. So you force the piece in front to move away, and then you take the weak piece behind it. The only reason this is worth it is because you're not trading. You didn't lose your rook. You just took the bishop for free. So that's a skewer. We also have a fork. And a fork is most likely to happen with either the queen or the knight. And the reason is that it's not most likely necessarily, it's simply most classical, because the knight hits a lot of weird squares. Remember, we talked about the knight, this knight can hit all of these squares. So if you just happen to have a piece on any two of these squares, the knight can hit them both. For instance, if the queen is here and the king is here, now this is a very obvious, they're right next to each other. You might get used to this pattern of the two diagonal squares from each other. You can easily hit both of them with one knight move. In this case, the knight hits the king, and the king must move, and then the knight takes the queen. The knight gets taken, but white is thrilled with that. So a fork is probably the most common seen tactic, I would say, for beginners. But you don't just have to hit two pieces that are next to each other like this. So we saw these two are diagonal. You also have, for instance, these two squares, and they're 3 apart from each other. So this is very commonly seen like this. Your rook and your king, when they start, have 3 squares in the middle between them. So if you can get your knight here, it forks them both. The king has to move, you take the rook, and you're doing great. So these are the shapes that you'll need to try to remember when you see the other person's pieces. Maybe there's 1 square between them, or there's 3 squares between them, or they're diagonal to each other. Or even later on, when all the pieces start to move and there's pieces all over the board, you might be able to fork from these squares, or these ones, or these ones. You just have to really keep in mind this shape. So that's for the knight. You're going to remember those squares. For the bishop, you're going to look at these. So if somebody puts a rook here, you can look and you can say, hey, look, those are on the same diagonal. If I manage to get, I know this would take some moves, but if I manage to get my bishop here, well, now this rook is pinned, and I'm going to win material, or points. It's called material. Similarly to the bishop, with the rook, you want to see pieces lined up with each other, horizontally or vertically. Right? This rook sees this whole line and this whole line this way. So if you see somebody, an opponent, line pieces up like this, you think, oh, okay, I know. I've seen this. I can pin it. Now, whether or not it's good to pin it is going to change moment by moment. But you just need to be conscious that these exist so that you can use them to manipulate your opponent. The other thing we should mention that is very powerful in tactics is if you attack the king, they are put under check. And they must get their king out of check somehow. So you can force an opponent, again, into a move. Forcing moves are fantastic for tactics because you know exactly what the other person's going to do. For instance, right now, if I was able to move my queen here, this is a fork. Now this queen hits both the king and hits this b7 pawn. I'm going to stop doing the paths. I'm just going to do the pieces, but I hope you can see them all from each piece by now. So the king must get out of check. Now there's a couple ways to do that. You can either take the piece that put it in check, which the black player cannot do here. You can simply move the king. They're not being attacked anymore. Or you can block with another piece. Now, by definition, as soon as you block with a piece, that piece is pinned. But in this exact scenario, it's probably the best move that the black player has. However, because the queen forked both the king and this pawn is now absolutely free to be taken. And while that may seem very simple, you will see things like this all the time. And this is especially powerful because now this rook cannot avoid being taken